I'm Eric Tonkery, Director of Marketing Education and Assistant Professor of Rutgers Business School. It is my pleasure to welcome John Uslay, Associate Professor and Vice Dean for Academic Programs and Innovations for Newark and New Brunswick campuses. John is a co-author of a recent book titled The Rule of Three, and I'll be discussing with him the theory and the themes that are discussed throughout this fascinating book. John, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Eric. Pleasure to be here.
Let me get started by asking this question. What is the Rule of Three?
So in a nutshell, any given mature and competitive market converges to three players, which outperforms all competing structures by about 150% on average. So these generalists are volume driven, typically above 10% share. And then we have specialists that are margin driven, usually less than 5% share. And there are niche players that are stuck in the middle between these two groups. And the primary forces that bring this about include the creation of industry standards, shared infrastructure, which then leads to excess industry capacity and ultimately consolidation to three players.
Have we always had a Rule of Three?
Yes, so we see this over hundreds of years of evolution. Let me give you an example of this. Automobiles would make a great example. If you go back to the outset of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1920 or so, there have been hundreds of manufacturers evolving with the automotives. Some sources say 2,000 firms were involved with making motor vehicles. But then the market went through a shakeout, consolidated to a structure with three dominant firms, and by 1930s, the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, had already emerged and began to control 3/4 of the market at that time. And by 1940s, they actually controlled 90% of the markets, and they continued to rule over the next several decades.
What share is necessary to be considered in the top three in your Rule of Three?
So these generalists tend to have above 10% share each, and they cumulatively control 70 to 90% of the market.
Okay. And you gave us an example of this phenomenon way back when you were talking about, obviously, the car manufacturers. Is there a more recent example you can share with us?
Sure. Let me share a more recent one. So it doesn't always take decades to observe the Rule of Three. In the case of food delivery platforms, which is merely 5 years old, it is already here. If you think about it, the market pioneer Grubhub did a pivot merely 5 years ago, and they currently have 23% market share. But they have already been surpassed by DoorDash, which has 43% share, and number three player is Uber Eats with 22% share. So in only 5 years, we have reached the Rule of Three convergence in food delivery.
Okay, so it brings to another question I have at the fundamental aspect of the Rule of Three. Why only three? Why not two? Why not four? Why not five?
There is a phrase in Latin that I like, omne trium perfectum, which means everything that comes in threes is perfect or complete. So if you think about it, most successful shopping malls tend to have three anchor stores. Most consumers primarily have three brands in their consideration set when making purchase decisions. So similarly, we think that Rule of Three acts like a tripod that provides stability to an industry. Four or more generalists, and you'll have excessive competition, which even stifles the specialists and drives down average industry profitability. And when there are merely two players, they can engage in price wars, they have a fight to the death. And even when they decide to coexist, they may create artificial barriers to entry, engage in excessive product proliferation or limit pricing, which is also suboptimal. And by the way, this is not just based on our observation or empirical findings. Other researchers have also conducted meta-analyses of game theoretic experiments, and their conclusion and the title of their article was, "Two are few and four are many." I think that sums it up right and happens to be just right.
That's a fascinating point you make about that, John. How do the consumers play a role in making sure that this Rule of Three is sustainable and is perpetrated through all the different industries? What is those consumers' significant roles in this Rule of Three?
So again, we believe it goes back to what is called the evoked set, the consideration set of the consumers when they make significant purchase decision. They typically focus on three major options. They may consider, and this set is not constant for every consumer, but then that also basically leads to a convergence to three generalists, the mainline players.
Now, in your book, you see these market forces that we discussed earlier have created the conditions where companies choose to become generalists and specialists. Could you actually, in your book, you lay out there's several differences, between generalists and specialists. Can you share three key differences that generalists and specialists have when you compare them to each other?
Sure. So the first one, a major one, is generalists are volume driven, whereas the specialists are margin driven. So that's a key difference. Another one, as their name implies, is that generalists will offer full line products and services and assortments by necessity, right? And then they must be omni-channel. Whereas specialists have limited and focused offerings, and they can also simply choose and use certain channels. And the third one is that generalists perform best as one-stop shops, whereas specialists should be worth a separate stop in the minds of the consumers.
What are the three strategies that generalists can take to sustain its status as generalists?
So in the book, we discuss offensive and defensive strategies based on the marketing standing of the players. So counterintuitively, the best offensive strategy for the top player is to stop fighting for share and focus on growing the pie. For example, if I'm Coca-Cola, why should I engage in costly sales promotion wars in my home markets? My resources would be better spent in increasing per capita consumption in emerging markets. Another viable strategy for the number one or two would be being a fast follower rather than first mover. And for number three, the best strategy by far is to focus on innovation. In fact, this is one of the axioms of the rule of three. Number three player tends to be the most innovative. It may not have the budget of number one or two, but it generates most commercial success from their innovations. For example, let's go back to the auto industry example. So it was number three player Chrysler, which arguably came up with the most important innovation in automotive over the last 4 decades, which is the minivan. And it also made the SUVs popular. Think about soft drinks. So today's number three player, the predecessor was RC Cola, and it came up with the most important innovations. It invented the diet cola, and it also invented putting cola in cans instead of bottles. Now, on the other hand, the specialists also have several options. For example, they can go up market, they can become super nichers. The Swiss have done in watchmaking. Another one is that they can grow the company to optimal size, such as 3 to 4% market share, and they can sell to a generalist at a premium. Examples of this are plenty: Maybelline, Snapple, Gatorade, Banana Republic, Dollar Shave Club, even LinkedIn basically have been bought by larger companies, generalists. Interbrand company even offers a handbook on building a market-ready M&A brand that specialists would benefit from if they want to pursue this approach. And a third option for specialists, which is very challenging, but it can also prove disruptive to an industry, is that they can grow the business and become a full-line generalist. And that's why it is fascinating to watch Tesla these days, which is planning to offer trucks as well as pickup trucks in the near future.
Next question is, what is a ditch dweller and why is that an unappealing place in the Rule 3?
So this is quite fascinating. Our analysis of almost 250,000 firm years from 1,000 markets over 4 decades, I might add, shows strong empirical evidence that firms do get stuck in the middle with 5 to 10% market share between the specialists at their left and the generalists on their right, and they do consistently underperform. They are ditch dwellers. They are surpassed by both the generalists that are volume driven, as I mentioned, and then specialists that are margin driven to begin with. So while you're stuck, you are surpassed by as much as 70 to 120% in terms of return on assets based on the industry group. So that's a dangerous position to be in. The simplest way to avoid getting stuck in the ditch is to keep as far away from it in terms of market share as possible. So when a specialist such as Bed Bath & Beyond, which has been more about Beyond than about Bed & Bath lately, right? When they get close to 5% share, it grows out of its niche and it tends to lose customer focus. By the way, Bed Bath & Beyond's market share in homeware and home furnishings last year was precisely 5%. And not surprisingly, from a rule of 3 perspective, that is, it announced it will close 200 stores, about 20% of its stores over the next 2 years.
Has there been a situation where a Rule 3 player wound up in the ditch and then they got themselves out of the ditch and back into the 3?
there are a few ways a ditch player can get out. Let's go back in history. Around 2000, we had two ditch dwellers in PC manufacturing. The first one was HP, and HP decided it couldn't get out of the ditch itself organically, so it decided to merge with Compaq. In 2001, the two companies came together, and about a decade after that, HP Compaq, the merged entity was called HP. It became the global leader in PC manufacturing. And HP, before the merger, had 7.5% market share, smack in the middle of the ditch. Now, another ditch player was called IBM. IBM also decided it couldn't get out of the ditch itself, but it decided it didn't want to be in the PC manufacturing business anyway. So it sold the PC manufacturing site to Lenovo in 2005. And a decade after that, Lenovo became the global leader, by the way, in PC manufacturing. And IBM today is a very successful service specialist. So it has downsized and become a service player.
How has the current pandemic impacted the Rule of Three?
Okay, so as you can imagine, if you didn't already have an M&A in the works, for example, it may be disrupted. So COVID-19 pandemic may slow down the M&A wave in the short run. It is hard to acquire a company sight unseen, but that doesn't mean the activity will come to a complete halt, of course. It can still happen if you did your due diligence. But I mentioned food delivery platforms. If you think about it, Grubhub basically just was acquired by Just Eat Takeaway from the Netherlands in a 7.3 billion deal. So M&A is ongoing. It happened last summer. And then Uber Eats, after that, they announced that they are acquiring Postmates in the United States, which has 8% share. So the M&A and consolidation towards the RE is basically still ongoing. And in the automotives, another sector we mentioned, just a couple of months ago, Peugeot merged with Chrysler, and they now call themselves Stellantis. So mergers and acquisitions are ongoing, and the prediction is that post-COVID, there will be fire sales of companies who were not able to adapt to the new realities, and they will be fetched by those who are able to adapt, and that will only further the consolidation across industries, and we will see the formation of the Rule of Three in more sectors.
Here's my last question. You talk about this new triad, replacing the old. First of all, what is the triad, and what are we replacing?
Sure. The old triad power was between North America, Europe, and Asia, led by Japan, which was powerfully absorbed by Kenichi Omahi. He has a book on this, which was a bestseller. Now, we are thinking that this is quickly being replaced by the new triad power. So the United States is still there. In fact, when you look at purchasing power parity, looking at the consumer's purchasing power, this is IMF data. US has $21 trillion of purchasing power. So it's still in the top three. But it has already been surpassed by China, and they currently have about $27 trillion in purchasing power. And then number three is India with $11 trillion. Then we have, of course, smaller players. Japan is 6 trillion. And then Germany, Russia, Indonesia all have less than 5 trillion in purchasing power. So we see the center of gravity shift from the west to the east and from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
Thank you for that on the explanation of the new triad. It's fascinating stuff. I want to recommend to our audience to pick up John's new book, The Rule of Three, fascinating read. And I think it's a great contribution to both the academic world and also industry as, companies look and try to figure out where they fit into the Rule of Three or industry in general. John, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Eric. And if I may, let me make one last observation. So all in all, we believe that the first third of this century will belong to China. As I said, it is already happening. However, the second third, India will come to prominence because they will have completed their infrastructure investments by then, and China will slow down because their one-child policy will come back to haunt them. However, in the final third of the century, it will be Africa who will be rising, and we will see the African nations become more and more prominent and become engines of growth for the world to round up our current century. But again, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you this morning.
Thank you very much, John.